Okay, hello people. So let's talk a little bit about the French Revolution. On the screen right now you can see that's King Louis the 14th or 16th, his wife Marie Antoinette, and Maximilien Robespierre the Radical. All three of them end up guillotined, as you saw when we went through the simulation the other day. So let's talk about some of the three basic ideals of the revolution, very similar to the American Revolution. First of all, liberty or freedoms from oppression from the monarch. Also, equality. And if you think of it this way, the revolutionaries in France were trying to get rid of the three estates so that you wouldn't have different estates. You just have everybody the same. So abolish the three estates and try and get the vote for all males. Even though there were some people during the Enlightenment who thought that women should have equal rights, they were in the minority. Most did not. So when the revolutionaries took over, they granted universal male suffrage. So every male was supposed to be able to vote. But the thing to remember here is France had colonies and they were practicing slavery up to that point. So those rights were not extended even to all males in reality. So that was another hypocrisy where they didn't live up to the ideals of the revolution. And also government jobs are supposed to go to people based on their abilities, not based on who they know or who they supported. So based on merit. And the third big value is fraternity, which is connected to equality. So if you get rid of all three estates and everybody's basically on the same level, you have brotherhood between the people of France. Okay, so the causes of the revolution. So before the revolution, you had the three estates. First estate was a clergy, they paid no taxes. They were given these privileges because they're Catholic church leaders and most of France was Catholic. So they could be rich at that time. Many nobles were also church leaders. The church could also tax the third estate through tithes. And then we've got the second estate. The nobles, they also paid no taxes. They made up, oh, that's blocked a little bit, sorry, about 1.5%, 2% of the population. Had the highest positions in government and the church typically. And look at how peasants could be hit three different ways. They could be taxed by the government. Most of them were Catholic, so they had to pay tithes to the church. And if they were working the land on the land of a noble, the noble could force them to pay dues to them to be able to do that. So they could be hit 3 times. And within the third estate, you got 3 big groups. Now remember, they made up about 97 to 98% of the population. You got the workers, the laborers in the city, the sans-culottes, or the longer pants like you see over here to the right, that gentleman. So they stood out because of what they wore, their fashion. There was high unemployment in the city, so those urban laborers were hit really hard economically. Then you got the middle class. Now notice the difference in how they're dressed. So if you're a middle class professional, like a merchant, you would wear pants that went down to your knees or just below your knees. So you could just tell visually if somebody was more of an upper class member of the third estate or if they were more lower class based on how long their pants were. So they had middle class people had money, but they didn't have the social status of the nobles. So they were envious of the nobles. And then finally we got the peasants who worked the land mostly in rural areas. And again, they had to pay dues to the nobles if they were farming on land owned by the lords. And because of the bread shortage, many of them were starving. And think about it, they're being taxed, they have to pay dues, they have to pay tithes, and they don't have any income coming in. So that's a really bad situation. So you can understand why they were unhappy. Okay, so there was economic reasons for this. The debt through the spending of King Louis and Marie Antoinette, and the spending on wars. France fought on the side of the American colonists in the Revolutionary War against England because they took the philosophy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so it was better to be an ally of the United States against England because England had traditionally been a rival of France. They also fought in the 7-Year War against England, including here in North America, which was over the fur trade. All right, so we talked about how Marie Antoinette and King Louis spent a lot on their palace at Versailles and on themselves. France was hit by economic depression due to droughts and blights that took out crops, and that also led to a drop in manufacturing, so they weren't exporting like they should be. So food prices will go up while unemployment goes up, so that's a really bad situation for most of the Third Estate. And then the other thing driving revolution were these new ideas of the Enlightenment, like individual rights, individualism, limited government, the idea that there shouldn't be absolute monarchies, the idea of the social contract, that you could, if the government abuses its citizens, the citizens can rise up and create a new government. So people were starting to think for themselves, and they're influenced by the ideas of Voltaire, separating church from state, Rousseau, the social contract and democracy, and Montesquieu, the idea of separation of powers within the government. So in 1789, just after the American Revolution, King Louis called all the estates together for the first time in over 150 years. And remember, when the three estates come together, the rub here is that each estate only gets one vote. And you know that the first two estates tend to stick together. So the third estate was going to be overruled in most things. So the king at that point wanted to actually tax the clergy and the nobles because that could help take care of the debt. But the first two estates said, no, we don't want that. Unsurprisingly, they didn't want to be taxed, so they outvoted the third estate. So the third estate decides, okay, we got to do something about this. We need a constitution that will limit the power of the king and then also, by extension, the first two estates. From the simulation, you should remember that the first two estates locked the third estate out of the convention hall, and that's when they met. The third estate met on that indoor tennis court that we talked about, and they took the oath where they vowed that they would stay there until they created a constitution that would create a limited monarchy. And King Louis agreed to their demands, so it's no longer an absolute monarchy. But at the same time, King Louis called out his troops to surround Paris to try and get control of the third estate. And the third estate reacted by mobs storming the Bastille fortress that was an armory and also a prison. So that's where the weapons were stored. The weapons had been moved, but still, they freed some of the prisoners. They killed the governor of the Bastille. And then they took apart the Bastille as a symbolic act. So that's why every July 14th, they mark this as Bastille Day. Now, right after this, the peasants in the countryside started to hear rumors that foreign invaders were coming in to try and put down the rebellion. And that was the period called the Great Fear. So how they responded to that is they attacked the nobles. And when they would sack their homes, they would many times go in and destroy the feudal records. So those feudal records kept track of which peasants owed debts to the nobles. So when the peasants go into their homes, when they go into the homes of the nobles, when they destroy those records, that kind of erases any debts they owed to the nobles. Now, around this time, a mob of women marched on Versailles to go to King Louis and demand that something be done about bread prices. because their families were starving. Well, King Louis and Marie Antoinette fled their palace of Versailles and headed back to Paris. And King Louis, against his own wishes, is forced to accept the new constitution that was created by this assembly of what was the Third Estate. And the name of that constitution that they create is the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And it's based on our Constitution. So that it's got things like freedom of speech, the rights of the accused when they're accused of a crime, and so forth. Freedom of religion, those types of things. So King Louis didn't think he really had a choice in that. So King Louis and Marie Antoinette and their family try to escape, but they're arrested on the way and they're brought back to Paris. And you remember this, they both get beheaded. Now, outside of France during this time, Austria and Prussia begin to mobilize to go into France because they want to reinstall King Louis to the throne. Because here's what they're worried about, and this is a really important point. The surrounding countries around France that are monarchies, their leaders are very scared that the ideas of revolution from France are going to spread to their countries, and they don't want to be overthrown for obvious reasons. So they want to restore the monarchy in France to try and prevent that. So in response, France declared war on Austria. So now there are threats from outside of France, from Austria and Prussia, and then within France, some peasants start to turn into counter-revolutionaries. In other words, even though they were for the revolution before, they turn against it. Primary reason is because most of them were Catholic, and during this period, as the radicals start to take over the revolution, they start to execute church leaders, Catholic church leaders, and many of the peasants don't like that. So the National Assembly, that's the government that was created after the Tennis Court Oath, when they created the Constitution, it now becomes, it's called the National Convention. And this is the point at which Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins arise to power, and they want to go further than anybody else. They want to execute King Louis and do away with the monarchy, period. Now, there were people who were in the middle, the Girondins. They thought that the Jacobins were pushing too far, and they didn't think it was wise to execute King Louis because they feared that that would turn the people against the cause if they did that. But that didn't matter because Robespierre and the Jacobins ended up sending King Louis to the guillotine. So among his followers, Robespierre was known as Mr. Incorruptible, the idea that he was true to the cause, he was authentic, and he couldn't be bought off. And he wanted to create a republic to replace the monarchy. What actually happens is he seizes the power for himself and he basically becomes a dictator. So there's another contradiction or hypocrisy. He created the Committee of Public Safety, which was supposed to take care of inflation and erase religion from society. But what it really became focused on is accusing people within the Third Estate of being traitors to the cause and executing them. So because of those threats from within and without France, they have to draft 1 million people, 1 million men into the army to try and hold back Austria and Prussia, and to put down any of those counter-revolutions going on in France. So after they execute King Louis, that's what starts that period of the Reign of Terror, where they go hog wild, executing approximately 40,000 people with the guillotine. And interestingly, only 15% of the people that they executed were from the first two estates. Vast majority of the people they executed were like them from the Third Estate, because they kept finding traitors, or at least that's what they believed. It's fair to say that many of them, maybe even most of them, were not traitors to the cause. So eventually Robespierre, his excesses, catch up with him, and he's executed by his own people. And the moderates gain control, who want to go slower. They want to pump the brakes. And that brings some order for a while, and they create this new government called the Directory. But people are still dissatisfied, and that's what opens the door for the great leader who will emerge after this, after the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he is a great military leader who parlays that into becoming a political leader and becoming a dictator in France. Okay, so at this point, what you need to do is you're going to look at some documents about the French Revolution. A couple of them are maps, a timeline, one really short document, and then a drawing or cartoon. So answer the questions, and when you get to the back page, this is the question you're answering. You need to pick out a couple pieces of evidence to support your claim. Either you're of the opinion that the Reign of Terror went too far, or you're saying, no, it didn't go too far. So maybe as something to keep in mind here is, in our own revolution, the American Revolution, there was also a lot of violence used. Is that sort of violence sometimes justified? Because with the exception of the time under Napoleon Bonaparte, France became a democracy eventually. So the radicals from back in the time of the French Revolution would probably say, look, yeah, we used a lot of violence, but it gave birth to a democracy that lasts to this day. Look at the documents, pick out, you got to be able to quote a couple pieces of evidence at the end. So I'm looking for no more than a couple paragraphs defending whatever position you take here. Okay, and the other three classes, most people got done with this during class, so you need to stay focused on this. That way you don't have any homework. It should be something that you can get done, or if you don't get it done in class, something you can finish up in prime time. Okay, I will see you guys, on Monday. Okay, Monday we'll talk about Napoleon. Wednesday we'll do a review, and then we'll plan on next Friday being the test on the French Revolution. Okay, take care. Talk to you later.